The Great Salt Lake is expected to reach its lowest point in modern history this year. Jonathan Bigliotti shows how the lack of water affects lives and livelihoods in Utah, where many farmers are struggling just to keep their crops alive.
I don't know how long we can survive because I don't know how bad it's going to get.
On his property north of Salt Lake City, sixth-generation farmer Ron Gibson is covering his crops with plastic to conserve water. His water allocation was cut by 70%.
If we don't get these crops to market, we can't survive.
He also says the cost of feeding his dairy cows has doubled in a year.
When agriculture's gone, then our ability to produce food is gone. That's what scares me the most about this whole situation.
The entire state of Utah is experiencing drought, more than 90% in an extreme category.
We would be standing underwater had it been a normal water year.
We met Zach Frankel, executive director of the Utah Rivers Council at the Great Salt Lake.
90% of our precipitation comes in the winter in snow. As our winter air temperatures continue to rise, we're getting less and less snow in our mountains.
Utah Governor Spencer Cox has declared a state of emergency and called on people in Utah to reduce their water use and pray for rain.
We need some divine intervention.
Back on the farm, Gibson says a continued water crisis means an uncertain future.
Your family's been doing this for 152 years. That's many generations. Do you worry that this is the last generation of farming in your family?
You know, I can't sleep at night, most nights, because that's exactly the concern.
We're told this marina would normally be floating on about 10 feet of water, but like much of the state, it has dried up. Utah feeds the Colorado River, and less water in the state means trouble downstream, impacting nearly 40 million people in 7 states. For CBS This Morning, Jonathan Bigliotti, Antelope Island in Utah's Great Salt Lake.
I don't know how many more alarm bells you need,
No, I feel for him.
21 of our 42 largest reservoirs are at 55% of capacity or less.
That's Todd Adams, in charge of the Division of Water Resources for Utah. And he says Utah's situation is urgent and habits need to change.
Yellow lawns are going to be okay. They're resilient. They'll come back. We've got to survive, not thrive.
The state is talking about changes.
Projects that include metering of secondary water, projects that include eliminating existing landscape.
The water is really waiting to get to Salt Lake and Utah counties via the Provo River and some long canals. So that's where the 2 biggest counties in Utah get much of their water. But wait, there's more people who depend on the Colorado River system for water, a system that needs our help and, yes, sacrifice. With a 360 look at the sources of Utah water, Max Roth, Fox 13 News. And Utahns do use a lot more water than most Americans. Here's how. We're going to use 2015 numbers from the U.S. Geological Survey water census, so they don't include conservation measures since then. They show, on average, each Utahn used 212 gallons per day, but average doesn't mean much. The USGS says Davis County residents used 75 gallons per day, while Morgan County residents averaged over 3,500. Look at the total public use in counties. This is overall, and the differences are stunning. Utah County used far more water than the much more populous Salt Lake County. Morgan County is 5th on the list with between 8,000 and 9,000 residents. But before saying too much, other uses dwarf public use. Imagine this pie chart was a pool of all the water used for crops, golf courses, and public supply in Utah each day. You may need to get closer to your TV to spot the sliver of pie the public uses. So where does that other water go?
This week, water levels in the Great Salt Lake in Utah hit an all-time low. It is the second time in less than a year that the largest natural lake west of the Mississippi reached record low water levels. The West is in the grip of a mega drought. The drying lake is having a dramatic impact on its surrounding environment.
The lone kayaker on Utah's Great Salt Lake is capturing a developing climate disaster. Brian Footen of a company called Earth Views is using a 360-degree camera so anyone on the internet can see what's left as the lake continues to shrink.
So 30 years ago, we would have been over there along the side of the mountain, and it would have been a shoreline, actually, not a lake bed.
30 years ago, the Great Salt Lake covered some 3,000 square miles. Now, at its lowest level ever recorded, it covers less than 1,000.
That's why it's important to do it now, because if you wait another 5 years, it's just going to be another record low. If the lake bottom is completely dry, the wind picks up and it creates dust storms that carry to the urban areas like Salt Lake City.
To figure out how severe those dust storms could be, scientists from the University of Utah bike miles across land that was once underwater. Kevin Perry is a professor of atmospheric sciences and an expert in air quality.
You can see this wall of dust, and it reduces the visibility, and people are very concerned about what might be in the dust that they're breathing.
To measure what is in the dust, Perry uses an instrument that in small scale mimics a dust storm.
And what that does is it creates a swirling wind inside this chamber that simulates wind speeds of up to about 50 miles an hour.
What he's discovered in the dust raises serious health concerns for the millions who live in the Salt Lake City region.
And unfortunately, we found very high concentrations of arsenic in the soil. And arsenic is concerning for a variety of reasons. It can lead to lung cancer, skin cancer, bladder cancer, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes.
How does arsenic get into this lake?
So everybody's wondering where the arsenic is coming from. Is it coming from industrial sources? Is it coming from mines? And the simple fact of the matter is that every measurement that I took over all 800 square miles of the lake bed was high in arsenic. And the only way that that can happen is if it's naturally occurring and has gradually accumulated here in the lake bed over thousands of years.
Preventing arsenic-contaminated dust storms requires getting more water into the Great Salt Lake. But that's not easy when Utah, like much of the West, is in the grip of what is now called a mega drought. More than 20 years of below average precipitation. This is the Bear River. It's fed by melting snow from the mountains here, and it's the main source of water for the Great Salt Lake. But right now, it's flowing at just 15% of what it would normally be doing at this time of year.
The mega drought is a contributing factor, but the biggest problem is our water use policies and the culture of water, not valuing water nearly enough, living in the arid West.
Okay, here we go. Joel Ferry runs a farm along the Bear River. For 5 generations, his family has been using water from the river to grow food and raise cattle. Every gallon you take out of the Bear River is a gallon that doesn't go to the lake.
At the same time, we have a way of life. You know, we have water rights to take that water. And so what we try to do is we say, let's reduce the amount of water that we're taking out of the Bear by doing irrigation efficiency practices.
Being efficient has become a necessity. Last year, his water allocation was cut by 30%. He has installed drip irrigation for some of his crops. Other fields have been carefully leveled to make better use of flood irrigation.
So what we're doing is really utilizing the water that we have in a more efficient way to make sure that there's enough to go around.
Agriculture uses about 65% of the water that flows out of the Wasatch Mountains. But demand for water by urban users is rising fast as more people move to the Salt Lake City area. Some municipalities even require that homeowners plant and maintain grass lawns. What's it like when you drive through the suburbs and see those green lawns and flower gardens? What do you think?
There's not a lot of economic value derived from that. It makes people feel good to have a green lawn. You know, we're not the countryside of England. We're the West. Utah is the second driest state in the country, and we need to probably act like we are.
Joel Ferry's commitment to saving water on his farm is one reason he's starting a new job.
The governor has asked me to serve as the executive director of the Department of Natural Resources. It's what oversees all water rights, water resources for the state, wildlife resources, outdoor recreation, all of these things. I'll be the boss.
His challenge will be convincing farmers, industry, and city dwellers alike in Utah to understand the vital importance of water conservation.
We're creative. We settled the desert. We can make this work.
Not only to save the Great Salt Lake, but also to preserve a way of life in one of the driest places in America. For CBS Saturday Morning, John Blackstone at the Great Salt Lake.
Leave it to John Blackstone to come out of retirement and tell us something we didn't know. I mean, had no idea. I was just in Salt Lake City, was just on the Great Salt Lake, and had no indication of this going on. And people are in tune to what goes on in Utah.
Now to what some tonight are calling a looming environmental nuclear bomb in Utah. The mighty Great Salt Lake is drying up, and as the majestic lake slowly but surely disappears, there's major concern not only for the wildlife that relies on the lake, but for people living in Salt Lake City and what it might mean for the air there.
Great Salt Lake, the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere, and the 8th largest freestanding lake in the world. But what used to be a boater's paradise and a safe haven for wildlife is now a looming ecological disaster, the lowest water level ever seen in Utah's Great Salt Lake. The lake now just 1/3 its usual size and shrinking weekly.
It's a little deceiving. This looks like a lot of water, but in fact, I'm standing in just a few inches of water. And under average lake conditions, I would be completely submerged, and you wouldn't be able to see any of this land surrounding me. Instead, 2/3 of the lake bed has been exposed.
That's nearly 800 square miles exposed. That's larger than the Hawaiian island of Maui. And the once desert oasis now potentially an environmental disaster with national and global implications. As the water goes down, the salinity goes up, killing the algae, which feed the brine shrimp, which feed more than 10 million birds that depend on the lake during migration.
What would it mean for these birds to not have this lake?
You don't have a stopover point. So they've got to get from central Canada to central Argentina or southern Mexico without a stopover. You just can't do it. You have to refuel somewhere in the middle.
As more land is exposed, it's becoming increasingly difficult for the birds to nest and find refuge.
And they're no longer safe from predators like a coyote anymore.
Correct.
Because the coyote can just walk there.
Did you think you would ever see something like that?
I hope not to, but we are where we are.
And it's more than just dry land that concerns state officials. It's what's lurking in the dust. As a terminal lake, nothing flows out, including toxic particulates, both naturally occurring and from decades of mining in the area.
The Department of Natural Resources says that sequestered here in just a few inches of water are harmful particulates. So if this dries up and this wind kicks up, they will be airborne.
It's very personal to us, and air quality remains at the top of issues for Salt Lakers over the last several years.
The area is prone to dust storms that could have the potential to be hazardous for the state's most populous city.
There's lots of toxic minerals, but the one that will capture most people's attention is arsenic. In the wintertime, we get what's called winter inversions that traps any particulates.
In the air.
In the air,
yeah. It's like putting a lid on.
Exactly.
Right?
As our winter storms come through and whip up some of this toxic material, i.e. arsenic plus many others actually, that's going to be deposited over into the Wasatch Front.
You're telling me that if the lake bed is dry during a winter storm, things like arsenic could be in the air for anybody in Salt Lake City.
Right.
And surrounding areas.
Yep, and trapped under the inversion.
What does that mean for people that live there? What kind of health problems could they experience?
Well, respiratory and cardiovascular. If you're compromised on any of those fronts, it's just going to be worse.
I don't know how much time we have.
Joel Ferry, a fifth-generation rancher and newly appointed executive director of natural resources for the state, has been sounding the alarm bell for years. Under his guidance, farmers and ranchers who use 65% of the area water to produce the state's top commodities, like livestock, hay, and grain crops, are making small changes with a big impact.
So that's called drip tape, and it's a little hose that gets buried. And what it does is it just pushes water in a small row right where the plants are. Drip irrigation will save 50, 60%. Without managing our water appropriately, life in the West doesn't exist.
Joel's land is on the Bear River, the largest tributary to Great Salt Lake.
It looks like it's hardly moving.
Yeah. In a lot of years, it's like this. The drought, though, has made it so much worse. So the Bear River is not getting the big flows down to Great Salt Lake to raise those lake levels. Normal cycle, Great Salt Lake goes up 2-3 feet and drops 2 or 3 feet. The last number of years, it's only gone up a foot. This year, it only went up a foot. So it's going to go down 2 to 3 feet. That's why we keep hitting these record lows. And the problem is, it's a shallow lake. There's not many more feet to go.
He says conservation alone won't be enough. They're looking at generational investments from the state and federal government.
Can they save Great Salt Lake?
They will have to.
And Lindsay, those airboats we were on were the only boats we could use to get out on the water because they can operate in just a few inches. Because as you can tell, this is what a lot of the lake looks like. I'm actually walking right now in the Antelope Island Marina. And so when you look back here, you can see all of these empty boat slips. And they actually had to take most of the boats out of the water last year. And this year has been the third driest year in state history. And so that is forcing leaders to say things like conservation alone is not enough. They have to consider drastic measures like piping ocean water in to save the Great Salt Lake. And Lindsay, they think it could work because we have to keep in mind the Great Salt Lake itself is actually 5 times saltier than the ocean.